Hello. In this video we're going to do an advanced application that we've entitled Austerity and Deflation at the Zero Lower Bound, a Contributions Approach. This material is taken from Chapter 13, Part 13.1, and it's going to include a spreadsheet-based exercise. In a previous video we learned about the ISR-TPC from an algebraic perspective, and by solving out the model we learned by how much shocks and policies will affect core macroeconomic variables. So in this video we're going to examine the case of an economy whose output is well below potential and whose central bank is constrained by the zero lower bound on interest rates. Now this is a situation that closely resembles the situation that has been faced by some advanced or industrialized economies in recent years. So to make matters worse, the country is now worrying about two threats. One is deflation, that market participants will come to expect even lower inflation and they'll be bringing down their prices even more, potentially a deflation, and also austerity, further cuts to government spending. So we're going to be switching now over to our spreadsheet-based example, and this example is based upon stage 2B of the model. Here we have, as usual, three scenarios: a baseline, Alt 1 and Alt 2, and under the baseline it's very benign. There's no shocks and full credibility. The expected inflation rate is equal to the target inflation rate. But it turns out that our country is facing something a little bit closer to what we're going to think of as alternative scenario 1, and the main thing is that it is facing a severe drop in expenditures. So expenditures are lower than they would normally be, and our consultant has estimated that to be about 8%. In addition, there are some rigidities that are keeping the inflation rate up and preventing the economy from going to full employment, and our consultant has calibrated this to be an adverse supply shock, and the adverse supply shock is about 4.5%. And then the third thing that we want to have here is that in fact the expected rate of inflation is actually a little bit lower. It's below the target. Let's take a look at our equilibrium. Our output gap is now around 7.2% negative. The equilibrium inflation rate is 0. The nominal interest rate is 0, and the real interest rate is 0. So we've kind of cooked up a little example here. Now, things are pretty bad if we have 0 inflation and we also have a negative output gap of this magnitude. You can imagine that people have been thrown out of work, but things could get even worse. And we're going to be examining these two twin threats. First of all, let's suppose that people lose faith in the central bank and they believe that the inflation rate is going to go even lower. So the inflation rate, the expected rate of inflation, goes down from 2% to 1.5%. And in addition, there are some members of the government who are concerned that over the long run the governments will be spending too much money and will be overreaching. So it turns out that they want to impose further spending cuts, and they're successful in doing so. We can think of this as something like the sequestration that's going to take away an extra 0.5%, an extra 0.5% of GDP as we go from -8 to -8.5. So you can see now when we compare Alt 2 versus Alt 1, we have reductions in the expected rate of inflation, but we also have more austerity. We have a government that, as a result of a political process, has chosen to cut spending even more, and that reduces demand. So now how does this affect output? Well, we can see that since we're up against the zero lower bound, lower expected inflation has to mean a higher real rate of interest, and that's going to choke off even more spending, even more consumption, and even more investment. Also, we can see that when we reduce spending and we face the zero lower bound, we're unable to reduce the interest rate. And in fact, because of the sort of topsy-turvy nature of economic life at below the zero lower bound, when we reduce spending, we reduce inflation, and we increase real interest rate even more, so we get this kind of perverse effect. And you'll notice here that this contribution to aggregate demand here, it was 18.6%, now it's 19.8%, and you'll notice that the difference here is 1.2, and that's greater than the initial reduction to expenditures was, if you'll remember up here, minus 0.5 as we go from 8.0 to 8.5. So what we're saying here is that the multiplier is greater than 1. We had a 0.5% reduction in spending, and that resulted in a 1.2% reduction in the output gap. So you can see now that when we put all of this together, we get a reduction in the equilibrium output gap that goes from minus 7.2% to minus 9.1%. I'll mention something else here, that once again, because of the kind of topsy-turvy nature of the zero lower bound, because we have this production-based shock that's keeping inflation up, that actually helps output rather than hurts output. We can see now that the equilibrium real interest rate is now higher, and the equilibrium inflation rate is now lower, and in fact we have a deflation here. So once again, we see that as a result of both the lower inflationary expectations and lower expenditures by the government, we have dramatically reduced our output, and we can see by how much each of these factors has reduced output. So there's some bottom lines here for policymakers. First of all, we've seen that when the country faces the zero lower bound, when it faces a severe economic downturn and expected inflation falls, that's going to force a rise in the real interest rates. It's going to force or encourage for even further cutbacks in expenditures. So the central bank wants to do all that it can to assure market participants that the inflation rate will not go down, that it's going to make attempts to keep to the target. In those attempts to maintain the inflation target and to communicate with market participants, the central bank may undertake some of the unconventional monetary policies, such as those undertaken by central banks in advanced economies in recent years that we discussed in Chapter 11. Second, during severe economic downturns, the government should avoid further cuts to spending or tax increases. Now, it turns out that in some countries, it was the market that forced countries to cut their expenditures. Why? Because prior to the economic downturn, a country's fiscal position was already overextended. It was spending too much, it was not saving enough, and it had too much debt. So here, this experiment underscores the importance of a disciplined fiscal policy during the good times, and if the country is successful in running a disciplined fiscal policy, not running up too much debt, then the country's government will most likely have more fiscal room during a downturn. And that means they might even expand expenditures, that there's a lower likelihood that they will be forced to take such cuts.